You're awful quiet.
I know. I'm gonna start making noise right now.
You have to turn that down, Homer. You, because I can hear it echoing.
Hey, folks. Make you turn my phone off so people quit bothering me. Welcome to the third edition of Steve Pierce taking us through an annual inspection. And we're very happy for him to be here. He is actually joining us this week live from Canton, Ohio.
Dayton, Ohio today.
Oh, Dayton, Ohio. That's right.
Canton's tomorrow.
So he is, because he's on the road on vacation, he's been kind enough to say he would do this remotely, which we're very glad about. And, our plan is to get through the rest of this annual inspection this evening, but if he falls asleep towards the end of it, we'll extend it on to next week if we have to. So we'll shake him awake. So thanks everybody for being here. Again, you're at the Wednesday night Hump Day Hangar presentations by supercub.org. And just so you know, get ready. We've done 17 or 18 of these in a row. Next week, we're taking a week off. But the following week is going to be an interview with 3 or 4 of the Flying Cowboys that will be live on here. So that should be pretty interesting. And so you might want to tune in for that. That's going to be on the 19th of August. So I don't know what you're going to do with yourselves next week. You can watch reruns if you want to. There's you can go check out the YouTube channel. All the reruns are available on there. So feel free to check that out while you're at it. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to turn this over to Steve Pierce. And you have anything to say before I pull up your slides, Mr. Pierce?
We're just trying to torture Lee. He passed out already. He's already asleep, so I don't get to torture him, unfortunately.
He's in a hotel room with his whole family, but his internet is way better here than it is at home. So that's the good news. So I'm going to get your screen going here. Let's see. Bear with us a sec, folks. We got to do that, and then we got to go up here and we got to give him control of things. Bingo, and right there, boom. You should be good to go, Mr. Pierce.
All right.
You got to click that little doodad that says you're going to take over. There we
go. Okay. So there we go. Okay. So last week we showed the video of the leading edge of the horizontal clicking back and forth because there was a gap in between the horizontal stabilizer and this liner tube. And so last week I had to put safety wire in one, and this is actually on a carbon cub, but same setup. But you can see where I put the safety wire in between the liner tube and the end of that horizontal stabilizer to take out that slack. And I just twisted the wire, and then I cut it off short, and I bent it under where nobody will catch their finger on it. And so I don't think I covered this, but what I do after I cut, what this is, and I've had this happen several times, had it happen on my dad's airplane after we put it together. So you get paint and dope and glue and all that on the end of that tube, and then when you pull that together to drill the hole, put this bolt that's in this picture in, you have to drill that tube. Well, you get it all pulled up tight. Well, then over time, that paint and glue and fabric all wears off the end of that tube, and then you get that slop. So what I've been doing is taking a flat file and going over the end of the horizontal on each tube, each end, the rear tube and the front tube, and clean that off to no paint and no glue and no fabric. And then I fit the liner tube, and drill it and all that stuff. So anyway, it's a common problem. I get calls on it all the time, and clunk, 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 and then it ends up wearing the bushings in the elevator and stuff like that as well. So anyway, let's see here. Okay, this was another thing that I get a lot. So you've got plastic grommets that are glued onto the fabric that are reinforcements for the inspection plates. And years ago, when we rebuilt my dad's clipper, we took the drawings and we took them up to my machinist buddy, and he water jet. We had him water jet those grommets out of aluminum instead of plastic, and I sell those kits. We sent them all over. Well, again, this is a carbon cub that came in last week. And so you can see that. So a lot of times those are number 4 PK screws, and you screw them in and they don't get tight. And then they fall out. So you put a number 6 in there, and then next time you put a number 8, and then a number 10, and it just looks like hell. And you got to figure out which size is which. So whenever I cut off a wire tie, I have a little tray on my tool cart that I throw the tails. So that is the tail of a wire tie that I stuck in that hole, and then I started the screw, and then I snipped it off with my old pair of flush cutting wire dikes, because my good wire dikes are only used to cut wire. But anyway, I cut that off flush, and then all those are number 4 screws, and they're in there tight and they're not falling out. But that's just a trick that I use because I get tired of that stuff. Another thing, if you've got all different size holes there, take a piece of cardboard, draw the inspection like I do the wing roots, and I've got a picture in this slide thing somewhere, but I draw a picture of that opening or of all the openings, and then I take a pick and I punch holes in it where all the screws go, and then as I take a screw out, I put it back in the drawing correspondingly so I can put it back, because I hate when there's a number 4, a number 6, and a number 8, you're trying to figure out which screw goes where. It reminds me of the old flight school I worked at when I first got out of A&P school. So I don't know why this rudder picture is in here, the counterbalance. I think we're going to the rudder. Okay, fill the bottom of the rudder. So all the water tends to accumulate at the bottom of the rudder, and if you grab that tube and kind of pinch, you'll feel crunchy crunch. That means you got rust in there, and that's the easiest way to tell. You'll kind of see it. It feels kind of rough, and then if you kind of squeeze on it, it'll kind of sound crunchy, and then you'll find what we found here on this one, where that bottom tube was all rusted out. Now I've got a roller, and I roll this. We just take a piece of 4130 3/8 and roll another tube and cut it out and splice it in. So, and then also this is the steering arm that goes into the bottom of the rudder, and you can see all that white powder. That's corrosion, because you got aluminum arm and a steel tube, and that goes up in there, and that's another problem. One thing about these, so Universe sells these new, and they're cast, which is kind of harder, and then Dakota Cub makes them, they machine them, and they fit a lot nicer. But you can see the steering arm at the bottom of this picture. Got that 114 Charlie. I found these that were held in with like 1 3/16 inch bolt. There's supposed to be 2 3/16 bolts holding that in. And a common thing to do is to grab where this rudder cable is attached, grab the welded on steering arm for the rudder, and then grab the tail wheel steering arm, the aluminum piece, and see if they move independently of each other. If they do, that steering arm is worn inside where those bolts are, and you need to address that, because it'll break that steering arm. It'll break it inside. I actually I got some bushings, and I drilled and then reamed and then put this oversized bushing through the rudder and through that steering arm, and then put it's got a 3/16 ID. I just upped it just a little bit and then put that bolt in there, and it took that slop out. But you'll have slop, you're trying to steer where you're moving the rudder, but then the tail wheel's not moving at the same rate because you get all this slop in that steering arm. There's another shot of it. That's those 2 3/16 bolts right there. And also, so there was a discussion on supercub.org here the other day about the tail spring attachment. Now, this is a stock tail spring. This is an 1.25 tail spring, and it's got the original U bracket. Well, that bolt right there that holds the bracket to hold the tail spring on, a lot of times I put a piece of rubber in there. Bill Duncan, when he was here last time, bought a big truck mud flap, and we cut strips of that on the bandsaw and then punched holes in it, and then used that between that tail post and that tail spring, and it'll jack it up a little bit to help eliminate. It gives you a better angle, which helps eliminate the shimmy. And I mean, I have seen fuselages where there's a worn spot where that tail spring has been wearing on that tail post fitting, forever, and it gets a little wear in it. Also, look at these. You know, I look at every. Can you go back on that one, Steve? I went forward and I don't have back control. So you see these clevis bolts that are holding between the rudder cable and the rudder. And those are supposed to be clevis bolts. They're not supposed to be a 3/16 bolt, it's supposed to be a clevis bolt. But every cotter pin, and those are cotter pin because they rotate. I put my eye and my fingers on every cotter pin on this airplane because I found missing cotter pins multiple times on control surfaces that would eventually fail and cause a serious issue, like control, you know, lack of control of that control surface. And also, you can see in that hinge right there for the rudder, that's got a cotter pin as well. And then there's bronze bushings in there. And if you grab that control and it goes clunk, 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 then those bushings need to be replaced. Now, I make a bushing tool to pull that bushing out, push a new bushing in, and makes it easier to me to use the tool than it does just to knock the old one out with a punch and knock the new one in with a punch. It doesn't mess up the bushing. So anyway, some other stuff to look at just from looking at that picture. Okay, I went too far, but can you go back one, Steve? I'm sorry, I'm impatient. Another common problem that I get into. So this is the bottom of the jack screw. This is the pulley, and if you look in the parts manual, there's two different washers. There's one washer on the bottom of that pulley, and there's another washer on the top of that pulley, and they're two different sizes. And in my parts manual, I've got it marked, but they're not AN washers. They're a bigger washer, a thicker washer, and they take up a lot more room. And I find that messed up all the time. I found them where the washers weren't in there correctly, so then this pulley is rubbing on this tube going across here. And so you've got all this friction in your trim system of the pulley on the tube. So anyway, something to, you know, make sure that it's assembled correctly. That's the nice thing about the drawing CD is you can see that, you know, you can look at that stuff. And so now what am I pointing out here? That's the jacks, that's between the jacks, that's the jack screw and the yoke. And, you know, Piper said to put grease in there. Well, had a lot of those freeze up, collect dirt, this and that. I lubricate it all the time. I spray it down with LPS2 and I just keep lubricating. I don't put grease on them. You can do if you want to do what Piper did, put grease on it. But I've had issues with that grease congealing in cold weather, collecting dirt. We had an incident recently where a guy lost it. He didn't have any trim, came in hot, tore his airplane up. Couldn't rotate the trim, and it was probably, I don't know this for a fact, but it was probably some congealed grease in there, because that's been the problem every time I've run into it. Take a string and a brush and some solvent and just scrub that and get all that old congealed grease out of those threads and get it good and clean, and then just lubricate the heck out of it. So here's the outside view also, where this is a 5/16 bolt. And so take the horizontal and shake it, move it back and forth, see and look and pay attention at what's moving. If you've got a clunk, 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 sometimes these bolts will have slack in them. And there's a Piper used shim washers between the ears on the yoke and the ears on this carry through tube. And so you can shim that out. And you can also just, you know, a quarter of a turn, a 16th of a turn of that nut right there and take some of that play out. But you want some play because that is a moving surface, and you also want to lubricate that. But you don't want that, you know, moving back and forth. You don't want to hear clunk, 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 either in this, in between the horizontal and the carry through tube, or between the carry through tube and that aluminum jack screw yoke. So lubricate and inspect and tighten if necessary. This is a video. Let's see. If it will play. Okay, this is the play that I was talking about where I put the safety wire. This is a custom. I met a mechanic recently, a friend of a friend, and he is not familiar with Cubs and sent me this video. Dang, Steve, your internet's not very fast. There it goes. And he goes to the other side because he doesn't realize how it's. I don't guess the volume's turned up on that, but anyway, that is where I was putting that safety wire earlier. So.
Steve, do you have any more videos?
Nah, that was it.
Okay, because I just didn't have the volume on. That was my bad.
Oh. Well, if you want to play it again, it was going clunk, clunk, clunk.
Hang on. See if I can figure that.
Jason. Yeah, he works for me. He's
That was that.
The safety wire fills in the gap. There's a gap there, and you're just taking out the gap with the safety wire, Peter. So, all right, you can go to that next one, Steve. It's not letting me for some reason on it. Okay.
Try it now. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the rear liner tube. So there's a front liner tube and a rear liner tube. And so when you run the jack screw, when you run your trim, you're moving the horizontal, the leading edge of the horizontal stabilizer up and down to trim the airplane. Well, it's pivoting on this rear liner tube that's depicted here. Now this fabric's off, and this is one that's in the shop for rebuild. And so what we found, you see this rust between the fuselage and this nickel plated tube. So there's a hole in that steel tube in the fuselage, and that's supposed to be an oil tube. You're supposed to put oil in that hole to lubricate between that liner tube and the fuselage, and that oil will creep in there and lubricate that. So if you don't lubricate it, it'll seize up, and I've seen horizontal stabilizers actually bend instead of rotating on the fuselage. They just flex the whole stabilizer. So, and then what we do on a rebuild is we'll weld a 1/4-28 nut on there, and then we'll put a grease zerk in it so we can pump grease in it. And these tubes can be a pain to get out sometimes. Like I'll put a punch in from the other side with a bolt where that bolt is. I'll put a punch on the other side on a rivet gun and drive that thing out. We've also had to replace this fitting on the fuselage because it was so pitted and torn up that you couldn't put a liner tube in. It was just real sloppy. Somebody asked between LPS 1, 2, and 3. LPS 1 is a clear liquid, a clear lubricant. LPS 2 is a oil-based kind of a yellow lubricant. LPS 3 is an anti-corrosion coating or spray. So I prefer that. I use the 2, and I use 1 and 2. If it's going to make a mess, leave a yellow streak, I use the 1. But I use more 2 than anything. I buy it in a gallon jug and put it in those aerosol bottles that you can put an air hose, put air to.
Hey, Steve, somebody asked a question about whether you use the grease zerk on the jack screw or whether you use LPS on it.
I use LPS. If you want to do it like Piper did it, use the grease zerk, but I use LPS. Now the grease zerk on the jack screw on the liner tube, that's fine because that puts grease into that tube. But on the threads of the jack screw, I use LPS too because I've had issues with the grease. Okay, here we go. Being contrary. Here's the washer. There's the larger washer that I was talking about that's between. See, that's not supposed to be there. That washer, that large area washer that's at the base of that jack screw should be on top of that pulley. So what this one was doing is the pulley was rubbing on this cross tube. That you got to look at the parts diagram, and it's better if you look at the drawing and you can tell from the drawing what it does. If anybody has a question on that, I don't have my parts manual with me, but I've got those call outs with which washer goes where by the size of the washer, which is confusing because you don't know which washer goes where unless you have the drawings and you look all that stuff up, or you buy new parts from Univar and you go, okay, you take it out of the bag and go, this is this part and it goes here. I don't know what I use. I don't even remember what kind of grease I use, to be honest with you. It's in that inspection sheet. It tells you what mil spec, and then you can cross it over to Aeroshell. But I use a high pressure graphite grease when I assemble it. You just don't want it to corrode. But I don't remember what the particular grease is. And this is the looking down through that jack screw at the pulley, and this is the one that doesn't have the big washer. It's supposed to be a larger OD washer between that pulley and the fuselage, and it acts as a spacer so it doesn't rub on the fuselage. I don't know why I put so many pictures of the same thing. Here's the call out. Here's some of the call outs. Those AN5 bolts that hold the carry through tube to the jack screw yoke, and this is all pictures inside of my in my parts manual. More call outs of different hardware stuff for that jack screw assembly. And the nice thing, Steve's got the Northland CD, or now I think it's on a stick, but it has all of these call outs in it. If you look at the drawings, if you're going to rebuild this or get into it, I would highly recommend that call out. Now here's what I was looking for. So if you look at these part numbers, and if you look at the picture that it just showed, so that 80122-41, that washer's 1-inch OD, okay, and then the other washer is the 1.125. So one's on the top and one's on the bottom, and you'd have to look at the item number over here. But these are my notes from going through all those drawings. So if you take a screenshot of that or write it down or whatever, but those are my notes on those washers. And what I did is I looked up all these part numbers of these washers and got the OD and the ID and the thickness and all that, and then I wrote that in my manual. So I put it together correctly from now on. So these are the tail brace wires on the tail, on the horizontal, the vertical fin to the horizontal, and that where that red arrow is pointing, that's a washer that Piper sells. It's in the Piper parts manual, and Univar sells it, but I find a lot of those missing. And what it does is that particular fitting right there bends more. It has more of an angle on it than the ones on the horizontal, and that's the one that cracks. And it'll crack right in that corner. And I've seen it more than once. There's a broken one. And I don't know why they put the washer on their back. They put the washer on their 90 degrees wrong. And you can see where it's circled, that stainless steel fitting is cracked. Now, the later Cubs had these fittings out of stainless. The earlier ones had them out of steel, and you'll see them really rusty and bad. If you buy them from Univar, they're made out of stainless, and they don't rust on the edges and then get all nasty looking like the steel ones do. So they're not cheap, but it looks a lot better and probably lasts longer. The other thing to look for is these tail brace wires are threaded, and you can see in the arrow, you can see just one or two threads sticking out on that end. Well, you want to make sure that you have threads extending into the nipple on the other side, right here. I found them where you got a whole bunch of threads on one end and no threads showing on the other. So you need to balance that out, because that's what's holding the tail, keeping the tail square. If you rip those threads out of that brass nipple because you don't have enough thread engagement, that'd probably be a bad day. See, this one, there's no thread sticking out. And this one, you got a whole bunch of threads sticking out. So this gets us into another thing that some people don't know about. So this bolt So I've got this 3/16 bolt that this long arrow is pointing at. That hole in that that fitting is got a 1/4 inch hole in it, and that bolt is 3/16, and there's a 1/4 by 3/16 bushing underneath the head of that bolt. Okay, and there's also one on the fitting on the bottom. You've got tail brace wire on the top and another one on the bottom. What happens when you trim the airplane is that rotates ever so slightly on that bushing. That tail brace wire fitting will rotate on that bushing on that bolt ever so slightly. I found countless number of these that don't have those bushings installed. So you get a 1/4 inch hole and a 3/16 bolt, and it starts to elongate the hole from the play. So look in the parts manual to show you those bushings. There's 4 bushings in that system. There's one on the top on each side, one on the bottom on each side. And sometimes they can be a bear to get in and get everything lined up and get the bolts, the nuts tight on the bolt. So, okay. Now, can you go back one, Steve? I hit twice there. Okay. So here, now, if you notice this opening for the elevator control is taller than a lot of, so this is a later model Super Cub, and they started making that grommet taller than on the earlier one so that you could get to that bungee spring on the elevator. The later Cubs and the Pawnees all had the same grommet and had a taller inspection plate right there. It just makes it easier to access. You can also see the grease zerk for lubricating that rear liner tube. And then you've got your bungee spring attached to the top of the elevator that is going to, as you trim the airplane, is going to pull that elevator. So before we got on this, Mark Inglerth and I, Mark's thrust line Mark, we call him. He's the kind of the rigging guru, and he wanted me to cover some of this stuff on the trim system because a lot of people get confused on what that bungee spring's doing and what it's supposed to do to the elevator. So I'm going to read Mark's note to me. He texted me this a minute ago. And he says, as you crank nose down trim in, the stick will be moving forward and come to a stop when the elevator is on its stop. Okay. So as you're cranking in the nose down trim, that stick's moving forward. Okay. You should have 5 or 6 full turns left when nose down with the elevators hit the stop. So in other words, once the stick stops, you should have 5 or 6 more turns of nose down trim before the trim bottoms out. And because what happens is, I don't know if there's short bungee cables that go to this spring, if there's short springs, whatever the system, the way that system's designed, once you start putting in nose down trim, that elevator start coming up. And so your stick is going to go forward and this is on the ground. So then the stick goes forward. Once that stick stops, count how many revolutions you work on the trim. And I've seen it anywhere from 5, 6, I've even seen 7. But you should have some trim left after the elevator bottoms out. And there was something else he said on that. If the bungee is too short, you will have the elevator deflected up and run out of nose down trim with a load. Just kind of a rule of thumb, not written anywhere. And it's just a simple check. Mark runs around. I mean, he spots fish. He's in a 180 horse Super Cub with a belly tank and, a lot of fuel, and he's up there for a long time. So this is something that he gets into, and I've run into it too. And I think from the post on supercub.org, this has created some confusion over the years. So maybe this will help clear some of it up. And I'm sure some people disagree with it, whatever, but this is what we found. So this is a well-used airplane. As you can see, that spring has worn well into that elevator fitting, that bungee fitting, and dug into it pretty good. So something to look at. Is that hole round, and is that spring been digging into to the fitting itself. But and then, like I was talking about earlier, your elevator and rudder bush, or your elevator and rudder bushing. So what I do on an annual is I'll grab this counterbalance on the elevator, and I'll try to shake it up and down. And if I hear a clunk, 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 then I'll put my fingers over the fitting right there where the clevis pin is between the stabilizer and the elevator, and see where my play is. More than likely, those bushings are worn. If you get a clunk, 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 those bushings get worn, and they're real bad on the 180 horse Cubs. Some of those airplanes that get flown a lot, I'm replacing those things every 2 years. But they're just a brass bushing. Universe sells them, and like I said, I make that tool to it pushes a new bushing in while it pushes the old bushing out. It's real simple, and I just do them one at a time. I don't remove the elevator. I just can move it enough to push the bushing out, the new bushing in, and put a new pin in it, cotter pin it, and get on with life. But if you've got a vibration, if it starts hammering back there, what happens is if it's hard, if it's hammering for a while and you don't do anything about it, it makes those bushings really hard to get out. It's like they hammer them into the steel. Excuse me, but and then when you've got a vibration like that, that just transfers to other stuff, and it wears other stuff out prematurely as well. So I try to keep all that tail stuff tight. And then somebody this week, I found out some stuff I didn't know about, breaking these jack screw jack, or the jack of the jack screw, the threaded part. I had not heard of that one before. And then there was a couple of cases, a guy posted a picture, and then a couple other people chimed in. It sounded like most of them were banner towers, but still something to pay attention to.
Hey, I want to just interrupt real quick, Steve. Folks, if you have
go back one while you're at it.
I will. Folks, if you have chat questions, send them to everyone or to Steve, because I can't see the chat on my computer. I see it pop up that I'm getting a chat, but it'll mess up this whole thing. Also, I'm getting we're trying to watch the YouTube chats as well too. So thank you.
So this is the flip up window, and this is removing the wing root fairings. And so this next picture, when I was talking about earlier, taking cardboard and drawing things out, because in a lot of these airplanes, they'll have all size different screws. And then when you're going back, you don't want to put a number 8 screw into a number 4 hole, because now you've just enlarged that hole. So what I do, this is a wing root fairing, and I just take a piece of scrap cardboard, I draw out with a magic marker, I take a scribe, and I poke holes just like what is in the airplane, and then I put the screws back in the cardboard just like they came out of the wing or the inspection hole or whatever. And that way it just saves me time and aggravation when I go to put it back together. Now, this particular airplane I rebuilt, and I put Tenderman nut plates in everything, Tenderman nut plates and nut plates in everything. So they're all number 4 screws. But, in my own airplane, I've got every size known to man in there and a bunch of zip ties, because, it wasn't done that way when it was rebuilt. But that's just something that I do that I found works easy. And it goes back to my first job as an A&P, that one guy took the airframe, one guy took the engine. We were working on Cessna 150s, and for some reason it's not letting me go. Anyway, they would just drop all the screws in one bucket. So then you got to go through the bucket and figure out which size screw goes in which hole. Is just a big pain in the butt, and just drove me nuts. So I hate PK screws, but if you got Tenderman nuts, they work good. Anyway, that's how I keep track of what screw goes where. Looking at, in that inspection, I don't have the inspection form in front of me. I didn't bring it with me, but you're looking at the top and the bottom of the wing. And I get up on the tire, I get up on a ladder, I look down the wing from the root, I look down the wing from the tip. I go over. The thing about fabric is it is a tattletale. If there's something going on, as well as I do, you can see, you can only see limited things inside that wing. But if you go over that wing religiously and look over everything, if there's something going on, you're going to know it. I don't see it so much in short wings, but in long wings, but in the short wings, we get a lot of broken ribs in the tank bay area, and you'll see it. The fabric will start cracking real bad, and you put your hand on it, and you push on that rib, and you start feeling it flex. And so if you go over this wing, top and bottom, look everything over real good. If you've got something going on, you'll see it. It's a good tattletale. Look at these cables. John Meade's airplane, they had run the aileron cable. They got it wrapped around. There's a compression strut in there, and they got the up aileron cable that comes off up the strut. They got it wrapped around that compression strut in there. And they might have had the compression strut in backwards. But anyway, the cable was rubbing into it. So even if you can't see the whole cable, take your hand and run your fingers down the cable as far as they'll go. I mean, I found a cable in a Citabria one time that was twisted around itself, around another cable. So you've got to do due diligence and feel it. Manipulate the controls and feel. You'll feel the friction if it's wrapped around something. I found, in the wing of a Pacer one time, we found where the cable had been misguided when it was assembled before it was covered, and you could feel it. It was just, and you could hear it kind of grinding. I mean, I've seen where cables were cutting through ribs because they weren't routed correctly. So you got to, it's just due diligence. But same thing on the other side, just looking over, from tip to the root, just looking over everything. And like I said, if there's a cracked rib or, something going on in that wing, you'll see it. It'll show up in that fabric. The wing, up in this area is probably the worst because of the drumming, from the prop blast and all that. And, you're in the prop blast area, you want to rib stitch, the close rib stitching. And we go out like four ribs because, we're using those long props, and I figure it's not going to hurt anything to do that. And, these inspection plates the inspection plates move around. You put a number 4 PK screw through the plate, through the wing fabric and the grommet, and through that spring tab in the inspection plate. And that helps keep them from dancing around. Also, I like the countersunk inspection plates that Bruce sells. But anyway, let's see. Yeah, you can see where there's a little bit of friction. You can see where these have been moving around a little bit, little dark spots around the openings. But and use doilies. Piper just glued a plastic grommet on the outside of the fabric, and then the grommet comes off. Glue a fabric doily over the top of that plastic grommet. It sure does reinforce that area and keeps those things from popping off. These pulleys here are on the top of the wing. That's the aileron cable. It's got the teardrop grommet over it, and these need to be lubricated and check these pulleys. I had a carbon cub recently that had about 500 hours on it, and I always stick my finger underneath the cable and manipulate. I move the cable back and forth, make sure the pulley turns, and then I feel that cable for whiskers. Well, both top aileron cables on this airplane had bad whiskers on it. And the only thing we could decide, because I've maintained quite a few carbon cubs, this is just a bad batch of cables. But both those cables had some pretty bad whiskers on it. And so I like to lubricate this pulley and then manipulate it, make sure the pulley's rotating, and then check those cables good. And check the cotter pin. And also, if you look at the leading edge of this, see where I had to notch? This is that cub that I rebuilt. I line that up. I line that cover up before I covered this airplane. When I put that grommet on there, and I had to cut that grommet out a little bit for that cable because I didn't want that cable rubbing, and I'm using aluminum grommet in there instead of plastic. But yep, LPS2 is what I use. And there's, looking down the wing and looking, just paying attention and looking for any, anything that looks abnormal. These are the pulleys inside of the wing, the main aileron cable. And they, same thing, look at, feel, manipulate, make sure things are routed correctly. They're not rubbing on anything. And then and you can see the cable here. And I mean, I've seen them rubbing on, you know, all kinds of stuff. This compression strut here, John's was wrapped around. They put the compression strut in backward. That's an end strut, and then they put some friction tape on there to keep it from rubbing through it. It was anyway. He got it fixed when he fixed it when he rebuilt the wings. But you know, just stuff to look at. Rib stitching. Now this cross brace, that's just for prior to rib stitching. It just keeps the ribs squared up. I mean, mice will eat that, make a mess, whatever. It after once it's rib stitched, that stuff doesn't matter. But look for cut or missing rib stitching because mice like to eat that stuff too. That can mess up your day. And then this is where that cable's coming out of that to that pulley on the top of the wing. And then look these fittings over. You see all this steel. You know, you got steel and aluminum, and these later Pipers, they've got the aluminum's primered, but the earlier ones weren't. This airplane was this was an 80, no, this was a 79 model, and it'd been in West Texas all of its life. And you don't see rust on the steel, but I've seen some that were just horrid looking. And these are those strut attach fittings that the service bulletin is on. You know, I had that one banner toe plane crashed. Look over your tip bows. This is a wing that we rebuilt, and you can see, you know, that's wood. And I use an epoxy varnish on those tip bows. They're made out of ash. You know, people say, "Oh, I'm going to make that out of aluminum. I'm going to make it out of conduit. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that." Well, you know, ash is really good at bouncing back. You hit something with it, it springs in and springs back out. They can be broken, but you can see this black at the trailing edge, and that's where water settled in the bottom of that trailing edge of that wing. And what happens, especially with dope, is it'll start pulling, and it'll take the roundness out of that tip bow, and you'll have flat spots. But you can see that rot is starting to rot there at the trailing edge. There should be a drain hole at the bottom of that, you know, right at the tip of the tip bow and that rib, so that any moisture can drain out of there. You can see this one's pretty good. Got a pretty good flat spot, and that's really evident on airplanes done with dope, where the dope continues to shrink over time. Where like polyfiber and Stewart's and some of the polyurethane systems, you know, you get the shrink out of the iron, and then that's it. Where nitrate will continue to shrink fabric and pull things. Here's some bad repairs inside of a wing. You know, there's a service memo on repairing ribs, and you know, there should be 4 rivets. You know, if that rib was cracked, there would be 2 rivets on either side of that repaired area. And anyway, see a lot of that stuff. I got a set of wings right now that there's not a correctly repaired rib in the entire either wing. It's a shame. This was looking in the wing root. You know, you want to look at the fuel lines, at the electric, you know, the electric wires, the antenna wires, the just anything and everything. Looking to make sure that everything's tidy and tied up, and you know, not getting into something. Look for fuel stains. This is the vent. So you've got a vent line going aft, and then you've got your fuel gauge hose coming out. You know, and I'm always looking for blue stain on any of that stuff. And sometimes it's just faint. You know, it just needs the hose clamp needs to be tightened up a little bit. But you know, you're just always looking at anything abnormal when you're looking inside there. This is the other side on the window. Same kind of thing. Look at the wing attach bolt. Look at the wing. Make sure the nut's on it. There's been cases. You read Dwayne Cole's book. He flew his aerobatic plane, got it recovered, came home, went back to get something done. The guy forgot to put the nuts on the wing attach bolt. So you know, stranger things have been known to happen. Also, your fuel lines. Make sure you know there's a fuel line at the back. You can see. Make sure the hose clamp's tight. You don't have any blue stain. And check for, you know, crack and dry rot. Those rubber hoses will get dried out. They'll last a long time, and they can crack and start leaking. So this is looking forward on the front left spar, this is well, you can see a probe for the outside air temp on an EI gauge, and another fuel line coming out of the tank and coming into the tubing. You got a rubber hose coming out of the tank, and then it's going to aluminum line going down the wing root, down the windshield pillar, and then you've got this is all headset jack wiring coming aft to the wing root. Just make sure all that stuff's tidied up. See this blue? You can kind of see this blue stain, and this is wet, and that's what you're looking for. Is make sure that because it can drip on the fabric, mess up the finish, cause a fire, whatever. But that's we're doing an annual inspection. That's what we're looking for. Smoking guns. Here's the again, wiring, ELT wire going up to the remote. You've got a wire here going into your overhead light to shine onto the instruments. A piece of coax for the antenna. You've got your nut for the wing attach, and then there's a wire there. That wire's not rubbing on that aileron cable going through there, is it? Hopefully not. That could be bad. That wire should be tied up where it's not touching, where it can't, get onto that cable. Also, you see up there where that cable's coming through, that's a piece of Teflon that's wrapped around with a zip tie. Now, Piper used a piece of like phenolic cardboard, and they used friction tape on either side for that, so that cable wouldn't rub on that tube right there as it comes into the fuselage from the wing. Here's the left side with the PDOT and the static lines, and you can see the cable and the nut and fuel. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. Look and look again, because like I said, there's a lot of stuff going on. You want to make sure that you don't have something rubbing on something or anything like that. Another fuel line. Then you see the headset jacks back there. Then this is the fuel line, and then a vent. This is a vent line back to the header tank if you're running the header system. Or if it's a headerless system, then this will be tying the two tanks together through the top of the fuel gauges. And if anybody watched that video that Corey Robin did where he stuck his airplane and his carbon cup on its nose, he tied a fuel pump and a fuel bladder into his fuel line out of his wing. And if you're going to tie another tank into in that case into the left wing tank with a fuel pump, you think about the fuel runs out of that wing tank to the engine by the head pressure, because that tank is above the engine. Well, when you plumb a electric pump in between the tank and the wing and the fuel valve, and you turn on an electric pump, that electric pump's putting out more pressure than there is head pressure. And in his case, he was pumping air and fuel, so he got air bubbles in that system. And what most people do, like what some of the guys I know that run, belly tanks, fish spotters, they plumb that fuel line into their top of their sight gauge. And so that way they can see the fuel going into the sight gauge, and they can get every last bit of fuel out of that belly tank. And they can see it because it's coming into the sight gauge and filling up that left tank. I know that whip air doesn't, or not whip air, air glass doesn't. That's not how their STC is written, but that's how some people I know do it in the real world, so that they can get every last drop of that fuel out of that belly, because you got no gauge on that belly, if you're flying. But anyway, that's that vent line on a headerless system. This is fitting the skylight. You can see the fuel line from the fuel gauge. It's going straight out of the tank, going straight into the gauge. That's how it's supposed to go. So I found a couple of cases where people didn't understand that fuel gauge works, because there's a line on the bottom and a line on the top, and it shows the level of the fuel in that tank. So this one, what do you think? This didn't work. So you get fuel, you fill up the tank, you get fuel in the bottom of this rubber hose, and guess what? It doesn't go anywhere. It gets trapped there. It's like a P-trap in your sink in the kitchen. So the fluid gets trapped in there, and so the gauge isn't going to work correctly. That line was supposed to go straight across there, not create a loop. Just some common sense stuff. Also, this is the fuel tank bay in the wing prior to putting the tank in. And as you can see, this is all SAE 50 felt, 1/16 of an inch, I believe. It's in the drawings. I've got the drawings for it, and I sell this felt. And this is what Piper used. And I've tried all kinds of felt. And the problem is you can't get the tank in there far enough. It sticks up. It does all kinds of. Since I started using the same felt that Piper used, I've had no issues. Now, if you look up by the wing attach fitting, so you've got the strap, you've got the ribs. Piper put felt on the ribs because the ribs will rub on the tank. Also, these angle braces that are between the butt rib on the left and the front spar, those wear into the tank. I've had to weld a bunch of tanks because that aluminum angle brace rubbed into the bottom of the tank. Now, on the short wings, they call out this felt on these angle braces. The Super Cubs, they do not. I've got rolls of this felt, so I put felt on everything. I just use a 3M weather strip adhesive. But this is the tank bay prior to putting the fuel tank in it, and the SAE 50 felt installed to keep from rubbing into that tank. And this is Piper, so the later airplanes, they just took rolls of that felt and they just wrapped it around the tank rod. We sew a sock, which is what Piper did on the earlier airplanes. They just sewed a sock that slides over that tank bay rod to keep that tank bay rod from rubbing on that tube that's welded into the fuel tank. And then also you can see that angle brace back there's got a piece of felt on top of it, as does the two tank bay ribs. But that stuff's going to rub, and you got a bunch of fuel in there, and that's a bunch of weight, and stuff can move around. And here's a welded tank. This is one that we welded up where the angle brace had rubbed a hole, or started rubbing a hole into the tank, and we welded it up, and then I primed it. But and then there's your fuel feed bung. There's another one. I find this quite a bit, and I was cheap. I etched the quantity and the octane of fuel into the Atlee Dodge tank caps because I didn't feel like putting stickers on there that could come off. So anyway, marking, and that's part of that inspection checklist is you're checking the fuel filler neck, you're checking the fuel filler cap, you're checking for capacity, and you're checking for octane rating. That's all things. And I get up there, I pop the cap, I look at the inside of the cap, I check that gasket. Is that gasket good? Is it marked? Here's a couple of that previous cap was an Atlee Dodge cap. These are Univer caps. And is that gasket good? Is it sealing good? Is it, because it can vent fuel overboard. Is the vent clear? It's letting air back into the tank and not collapsing the tank. Here's some deteriorated fuel tank gasket. Also, on these caps, if it's real hard to put that cap on, especially the Atlee Dodge ones, if you put a flat screwdriver underneath that tab and just pry up just a little bit on either side, and then try it and just go back and forth and just take some of that tension off of that tab where you can actually get it on. I mean, I've had them where you had to get a wrench up there. I mean, that's ridiculous. You need to be able to get it on and off by hand. So this, when you drop hardware, pick it up, find it, figure out where it went. This was a washer that was embedded in between the felt on the tank strap and the fuel tank. And this was a pretty new airplane that I was doing some work on. I had to pull the tank out, and I happened to hear something fall, and I looked, and there was an imprint of that washer. And then on the tank, you can't really, it's hard to see in this picture, but there was an imprint of that washer on that tank. Well, over time, that was going to wear a hole in that gas tank. And that was going to cause a problem and then, create a lot of work. So, if you drop stuff, figure out where it went, get a magnet. So this is the fuel tank covers. So I've had this discussion. The FAA says that these, so the FAA in Alaska approved Randy Appling's carbon fiber tank covers. They said that these are just fairings and, it doesn't matter what they're made out of or whatever. I disagree. I've had discussions with Wayne Mackey about the same thing. He covers them in fabric to save weight. So the tank cover, Piper used 3003 aluminum on everything. It's soft. It's not structural. However, on these tanks, these tank covers, Piper used 2024 T3, 32,000. So in my mind, if this tank cover was not structural, it would not have been made out of 2024 T3 by Piper because they were doing stuff as quick and as cheap as they could. Also, I find these crack a lot where these screws are holding the tank cover down. If this wasn't structural, why does it crack? So I end up having to patch these a lot of times, but that's just food for thought. You can believe whatever. I have my own thought. Here's a crack emanating out of one of those screw holes, which tells me that tank bay is flexing and that tank cover is structural. But here's one that I patched with a flush patch. A Cessna gasket instead of a Piper gasket might work. I mean, they use pretty much a lot of the common stuff, but Univer has the gasket, so I just use the gaskets from Univer. But there's the inside of the patch. You don't want the rivets to interfere with the rib or the false spar. I get this a lot. So this false spar, this is the leading edge skin of the this is the leading edge skin of the wing and the fuel tank cover. Okay, and that leading edge skin is raised up above that spar by about 7/16 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. Well, I guess it's half an inch or more because these are half-inch screws. These are 1032 half-inch screws is what Piper calls out for to hold this tank cover on. I found 5/8 screws, 3/4 inch screws, and I found spars that have big gouges in them from too long a screw being used and digging into that spar cap. Well, to me, the spar cap's a structural part of that wing. It's going to keep that wing together. And when you start grinding holes in it with a screw that's too long, it's just sitting there working. It's not a good thing. So these screws need to be half-inch, or they should be a half of an inch. No, not any longer. If you put a longer screw in there, it's going to go into your spar and it's going to mess up the spar. So 1/2 inch long, and it's in the parts manual on the front first page. When you get it, and this is the nut plate in that leading edge. You can see the nut plate, and then you can see a cable with, a mud dauber nest, and anyway, that's the tank bay with the tank in it. That's one that I took apart and found lots of fun surprises in. There's a whole bunch of mud daubers. They were having a field day inside there. Another thing that I see that's wrong, this is the wing root fairing is over the top of the tank cover. Piper never did it that way. They put the cover, the wing root fairing was underneath the fuel tank cover, and the screws for the fuel tank cover went down through that wing root fairing. In this case, what's happening is the screws, so you put the fuel tank cover on, you put screws down to hold the tank cover, then you put this wing root fairing over the top of that cover, and the screws that are holding the fuel tank cover on start rubbing up through the wing root cover. This is incorrect. And this has been, so here's the correct way. You see the wing root fairing is underneath the fuel tank cover. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way Piper did it. That's the way the drawings show it. That's the way it works the best for me, where you don't wear holes in things with the tops of the screw wearing through the top of another sheet of aluminum. The other thing to look for is if you look in the corner where that, this top fairing is got a screw in that hole in the bottom left-hand corner. There's a hole in that trailing edge of that wing root fairing, and you tighten that screw up. You attach it at the front at the leading edge, and then you tighten that up and get some tension on that wing root cover to pull down tight over the skylight and over the wing, and you'll get cracks in that trailing edge piece. And those things need to be addressed because this wing root fairing will get sloppy and flop all over the place. Here's one where you can see the screw. You can see where it's got smoking. There's a screw. There's a screw underneath that fairing, and you can see the smoke coming off of it where aluminum rubs on something. It creates smoke, but this is a wing root fairing installed over the tank bay cover. You can see where there's a screw in that butt rib that's rubbed through that fairing, created that smoke. Another one that's installed incorrectly. And also, can you go back to that last one, Steve? Also, see this fairing in front of the flap. That's been discussed on the website. People forget to put that gap seal between the wing and the flap, and that's a flap gap seal. And I talked to a couple people that put them in after the fact and said it made a huge difference on their flap on the flow flight. So you can see where the wing root fairing is rubbing into the fuel tank cover. You see that black line underneath that fairing. And like I said, I believe that tank cover is structural. But then this is the trailing edge of that wing root fairing where you adjust it to pull that tension over the top of the wing, and they crack right outside of this hole. These I made new, and I used flush rivets for the fairings, and made all that out of 2024 T3, which is stronger instead of that 3003 soft stuff. And then this is a late model Cub. It's a 79. It's got the aluminum flap. This is one that somebody compensated, and they cut a notch out. And they kind of made the fairings how they wanted to make them, and they didn't fit worth the flip. So you can see it's got a big gap, and they got a notch up there cut. Take the old parts or buy the parts from Univer, or take the old parts and measure off of them. You can see this notch they cut so that the top fairing can come down far enough. Again, the flap gap seal, that's what I was highlighting. There's the flap gap seal, making sure you got flap gap seals on. Let's see. Yep, there's flap gap seal again. And that's a common deal. Seen several airplanes without them. Then we get into the ailerons and flaps. The hinges on the ailerons and flaps are made out of steel. And, look between the steel and the aluminum. A lot of times you can't see anything. These are some that I've drilled apart because you get dissimilar metal corrosion between the aluminum and the steel. And it's, look in there and see if you can see anything going on. More than likely you can't, but if you can, you got some serious problems because of dissimilar metal corrosion. But like I said, these are some that I took apart at rebuild and found the rust and corrosion. And you can see that white powdery, that's the corrosion between that steel and aluminum. I've had ailerons where there's a hole completely through it, through the spar. And anyway. Oh, and there was somebody posted on Facebook recently. It was a clipper, and they were grabbing the aileron and moving it's got the same aileron as Super Cub, and they were moving the bell crank on the aileron independently of the aileron itself, which told me that whole thing was corroded away and in really bad shape. That'd be a total control system failure. Would not be a good day. And that's what you're looking for on those cables. That's an aileron cable, and that is that aileron cable is right. I believe this one was where it came out of the fuselage, where it came off that pulley. So the wear places I've found is where the cable comes, where it starts to go up the lift strut, comes out of the fuselage at that pulley in the fuselage that we showed that's right there in the floor, kind of in front of the back seat. Then where we showed on top of the wing, where it comes out of that blister and goes to the top of the aileron. And then also the first fair lead up the lift strut on the seaplanes that came with stainless steel cables. Going through the records of the last one that I rebuilt, every 500 hours they would replace the aileron cable. And it had been 500 hours when I rebuilt the airplane, and at that time both of those cables were worn. It had frays like this at that nylon bushing that fair lead, that first fair lead up the lift strut from the fuselage. There were frays started. Now those were on stainless. I haven't seen that on the galvanized, but on the stainless. And this particular airplane left Piper as a seaplane. But look over everywhere that I've also seen them where they came through the fabric, if you can believe that. But most of the problems I've seen have been with stainless cables, not with galvanized cable. But look, anywhere that cable touches something, feel it, look at it, get a magnifying glass, take a rag, rub down it. A rag will grab those whiskers. You don't want to grab them with your fingers; they don't feel very good. This is the check these hinges, lubricate these hinges, check these cotter pins, check the safety of that turn barrel. That should be a Clevis bolt, not a regular bolt. And then 2 washers. The reason there's 2 washers is you don't want the threads in the shear part of that joint there. You want the shank of that bolt. These are special Piper rod ends, Clevises. The AN ones do not work unless you go to grinding the metal on the aileron bell crank, which has been known to have been done. People have done it. Now there's a comparison. The one on the right is where somebody smarter than Piper and smarter than their wallet, basically, they used an AN Clevis and installed it. You can see where they ground the paint off that aileron. That's the newer Dakota Cub aileron, but they ground it down so that they could get that fork in there. And then on the left is a Piper fork. And those Piper forks aren't cheap, but it is the correct part, and you can put it in there without having to grind on the structure of your parts, of your ailerons. And I've found multiple times. That's real aggravating to me. There's another one. You can see there's not even enough gap to get the safety wire through there, so they had to wrap it around the bolt. That's just blatant to me. I mean, it's just if something doesn't fit, figure out why it doesn't fit. Don't go grinding. But anyway, there's one where that fits correctly, but it's got a bolt instead of a Clevis. They'll check your aileron and flap hinges because they wear. And if you take this is, I think that's an aileron. Outboard aileron, inboard aileron bushings will wear, or what it is, not really a bushing, it's got this aluminum block. And you want to address this because if this starts wearing, it will wear on the aluminum first. But if it's allowed to go for a long period of time, it'll wear the steel out of the aileron itself. Now, you can replace these aluminum blocks by drilling out these 2 steel rivets. It's kind of a pain. Univer bought the STC. There's a guy in California that had the STC to put a stainless steel hat bushing in the aileron and in the aluminum block. And you ream it, it comes in a kit, you ream it and you epoxy these hat bushings in, and they're made out of stainless, and they'll take that flop out. And that's Univer owns that STC now, but there's not a bushing in here, a replaceable bushing. You have to replace that whole aluminum block, which is grinding these steel rivets down and then drilling them and getting that block out and replacing the block. It's not a fun process. These Aileron stops, you've got a control stop inside the underneath the rear stick to keep to get the control throws the way they're supposed to be. These stops here, this stop that that with this 1 3/16 bolt, that's to keep in a windstorm or something, to keep that aileron from going too far over, or too far under. Uh, it's not a control stop, so to speak, for deflection. Um, I've heard of some people that didn't have those and they got their ailerons bent forward in a bad windstorm. But and I've seen these where the top was rusted because water got into that tube's open and water got into that tube and rusted it out. But again, we're checking cotter pins, we're lubricating. LPS 1, LPS 2. LPS 1's not as ugly when it streaks back. And then check that bushing, make sure that is tight. Usually in the center bell crank doesn't wear like the other ones do. This one wears. This is the inboard aileron. No, that's the flap. I'm sorry, the flap one. Just take the flap and push up and down and hear, listen for a clunk, 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 and make sure it's not the actuating rod on the inboard, but the flaps tend to wear as well. And same deal with that kit from Univar, or replace that aluminum block. This arrow is pointing. You see, this is the inboard flap hinge, and you see that where that arrow is pointing, and you see that flap hinge can get hung up on the corner of the wing attach hinge, the wing attach fitting. Okay, there should be a washer in there. You see that, so I'm pointing at the two washers. There's supposed to be a 1/4 inch AN 960-4 16 washer in between the hinge on the flap and the hanger on the wing, because that forward picture, that corner will catch like this one. You can see the paint's all buggered up right there, and there was no washer in there. And so every now and then that flap would get hung up on the corner of that bracket and it wouldn't go up all the way. So, and you could have a differential, a little bit of differential flap. There should be a washer in there. There should be a gap because there is an interference issue there. You can see where it's flush up against it. And anyway, something to look at. You can see where it peeled the paint right there from the interference. Same there, it peeled the paint off because it was hitting. So make sure you got a washer in between the bracket, the wing attach bracket, and the hinge on the inboard flap hinge. This one pissed me off. this one was aggravating. So somebody decided to put a Cessna hinge or a Cessna pulley in here, so they welded a washer over the pulley cage, and then they made their this block between the strut attach fitting and the pulley bracket, that square piece that's supposed to be round. It's too long. Anyway, this airplane was a mess. It took us a lot of time to get this thing back to airworthy, and people took a lot of liberties because they built the airplane and sold it. It was one of those deals. They bought it for cheap. It needed to be recovered. They recovered it, and then they took liberties with it and sold it. And then it came to me, and took a lot of time to get it right. But yeah, that welded washer and that small bolt was a dead giveaway. That's my helper. She supervises everything I do. That's Alley Cat. So rust and corrosion. These hinges are steel, and they've been on how long since that was recovered, and what kind of primer did Piper use? Not very good. So you can see this rust emanating out of this hinge, and look that stuff over, because we're going to see more and more issues from rust and corrosion in these airplanes, because some of them are 70 plus years old, and they've been recovered several times, but have they been rebuilt? Have they taken the steel out and bead blasted it and epoxy primed it and put polyurethane top coat on it and put it back together? Or has it just been recovered? So you got dissimilar metal corrosion between aluminum and steel, eating away at it. grab that hinge and move up and down on it. Does it move? Does it shake? It shouldn't. It should be solid. But, just due diligence, look for rusty stains. I mean, there's a lot of tattletales that I'm pointing out here that, a lot of it's common sense, but a lot of it, if you don't think about it, oh, it's been, that IA looked at it and that IA looked at it. Well, they might not have paid attention. And so, look for that stuff. You can see this rust. I mean, it's just that U channel is just catching. And see, this aluminum block, this hinge block, there's a corner cut out of those so that moisture can run out of that U channel. That steel, where that rust is a U channel. So water can get in there and it should run out the trailing edge. But it's got paint and dope and all kinds of dirt and stuff in it. Take a piece of safety wire and stick up that hinge between that aluminum block and that steel hinge and clear that out so moisture can run out of it, water can run out of it, because it'll collect in that steel hinge and they'll rust, just like this one is. You can see the rust stains on it. This is the inside of one of those hinges, and you can see where it's riveted to aluminum false bar. Well, you get dissimilar metal corrosion in there, and that'll deteriorate that false bar, and you can see all the rust inside that fitting. You can see all that, there's dirt collects moisture starts rusting. Clyde Smith told me that Piper used the dope out of the bottom of the vats for primer. I mean, they didn't use, I think later years they used good primer, but early on they just sprayed some stuff on there. They weren't expecting these airplanes to last this long. There's some dissimilar metal corrosion where I've drilled one of those hinges off. You can see where those steel fingers and that white, that's where that aluminum and that steel were having a party and exfoliating. This is one of those stainless bushings for that STC that Universe sells, and that's epoxied in, and they give you a fitting to hold it in while the epoxy sets up, and they give you the reamers and everything. It's a nice kit, and it's stainless, so hopefully it'll wear the pin, not the fitting next time. You can see this. You can see how this hole is pretty walled out, and I think this was on Kathy's tri-facer actually that I did the first one. So this was an interesting one. This is a 1972 model Super Cub, and somebody was afraid, they didn't like the flip up window. Evidently was beating against the bottom of the wing. No, there aren't any sacrificial anodes that I know of. Piper just shot paint on them and figured they'd be recovered in 5 years. But on this wing, you see that red arrow. That's a U-bolt, or that's an Allen head bolt that somebody screwed into the spar cap and put a rubber cap on it so that the flip up window wouldn't sit there and shake on the wing. Why you get your hand up, Kathy? I got a little thing that says your hand's up. So when I drilled, or when I uncovered this wing, let's see here. Oh, I'm getting used to this. Come on. There we go. This so this is that internal wrenching Allen bolt, and it went up through the spar cap, and it cobbed the web. It got on the web of the spar. There's the hole in the spar, which I wouldn't want to fly around worrying about. And come on, there it is. So that's where it cobbed the spar web, and to me it compromised the structural integrity of that spar. And we had a short question with the owner. Well, what do you think? And I said, well, I wouldn't want to worry about it if I'm flying around at gross weight in the mountains in turbulence. And, I wouldn't want to look out that wing and wonder, well, is it going to hold? Is it not? I'll spend the $300, $400 for a new spar and have peace of mind. So decisions you get to make. These are so you get into inspecting the flap mechanism, manipulating the flaps. This is the bell crank on the flaps, the cotter pin where it rotates. That's a cast aluminum bell crank. And this is not a good picture, but where this bell crank is in a fork, people will over tighten that and will crack that bell crank right there. And that's from over tightening. And there's a specific length bolt and specific washers and stuff called out in that parts manual for that and in the drawing, so that it will not be over torqued and will not crack that casting. But that's a common PA-12, same thing on the Aileron bell crank. That's that fair lead that I was talking about, where I see the first signs of cable wear. That's the first fair lead up the strut, and that cable will start wearing right there at that fair lead. You'll get little whiskers. You can see that that's a better shot to get an idea of where that fair lead is. This was a good one. I got this the other day, a couple of weeks ago. Somebody wanted to know how many threads could be showing on a Piper strut, and dang it, I have to look that up now. I think it's 18. It's in my Clyde Smith notes, but that was a little excessive, and I think I posted that on the website because it did not meet it was in the rigging. It was in the rigging. I finally found where Piper called it out. I think it was in the rigging instructions or something, but I finally found it. But it's, let's see here, 15 thread max showing on a lift strut. And I finally found it in a service memo somewhere, but this was way more than 15 threads. And they were trying to rig out a fuselage that's been repaired and not repaired right. But anyway, I had a mechanic over in Dallas Fort Worth area contact me asking me that question, and I told him what I had in my notes, but then I had to go find the reference, and I finally found it. But another thing, so those strut attach bolts are special Piper bolts, and they're shorter. They've got shorter. The threaded area is not as long as a regular AN bolt, and that the reason that is you do not want any threads in that shear area between that fork and the fuselage fitting. Also, you don't want the bolt extending down past further down. If it was longer, this gear, if you prang a landing, the gear will hit the bolt and it'll bend the gear, because and there was a service bulletin, because Piper was selling NAS bolts for that for a while that were long, not like the special bolts that Univer has. And so then you had to put the bolt in. So they came out with a service bulletin, and you had to put the bolts in upside down so that they wouldn't be too long to hit the landing gear. Well, the problem there is you're out in the middle of the field, and some guy's knocked his gear off, and you've got to pick the airplane up and take the gear off. You got to take the wings off, you have to take the gear off, because you can't get that strut bolt out. And I had to do that, and it wasn't much fun. So if you get the bolts from Univer, they're the special Piper bolts under the Piper part number, and they just have enough threads to catch that nut, and there's no threads in that shear area, that fork, and that fitting. So I found that a couple times, actually. There's one right there. You see it's too long, and then you see on that gear, you see that little pop mark right underneath that bolt. That's where the gear was hitting. So you can see how much longer that thread is than that nut. And if you go back to the fitting or the picture before, those threads didn't. There's not that much thread sticking out on the bottom of that, not near as much. So another one of those little things that just irritates the snot out of me. But if it was easy, everybody'd do it. Can you play that? Another video. I don't remember this one.
That's some crazy music going on there, Pierce.
That was probably some Joe Bonamassa or something. Who knows? You missed Paco was laying on a dozer in the background, but that was this common problem of getting that head getting loose on the tail spring. I tell people as a pre-flight, go back there and kick that tail wheel and look and see if that tail wheel's moving on that spring. Crash Jr., if you don't know who Crash Jr. is, that's Crash's son, Gabe, that works at Airframes. He's been participating in the tail wheel shimmy discussions, and anyway, he was talking about these springs coming off real easy, and I don't know, the universe springs I've been using, I got to use these pliers, these inner snap ring pliers to spread those apart to get the chains off. I posted some pictures and actually found another set of these pliers on eBay. But I've got a toolbox that I keep all my tail wheel stuff in. And anyway, this is spreading that spring out to get that chain off. And I take the tail wheel off at angle and I go through it. I take it apart, I clean it, and because I find a lot of tail wheel problems. Now this is spring arch, and there's a thread, a current thread on supercub.org about this. So this spring in the front, closest to the screen, is an older Pawnee spring that's been on the airplane. Who knows? I've seen them lose their arch in a year. And then on the bottom is an airframe spring that's got the proper arch to it and won't shimmy. But you can see the difference. And I mean, I've literally seen these springs lose that arch in a year and start shimmying on a heavy tailed Cub. This one on the bottom that's real flat, that was the first Super Cub I rebuilt. You couldn't even steer it on the ground. It was so bad. And that guy, that was the cause of that accident, in my opinion. Because that spring was so flat, you couldn't manipulate the tail wheel because of it. And it contributes to tail wheel shimmy. So pay attention to the ass end of that airplane, because it's going to tell you it gets more abuse than anything if you think about it. And there's the same thing. Now these are 2-hole, and I ended up putting my head would get loose on my spring, and Tony that I fly with all the time, he went with a two-headed or 2-bolt head, and so anyway, the next time mine was loose, I went with a 2-bolt head, and I haven't had any more issues out of it. But you can see the difference in the 2 springs. You know, that spring on the right's got a lot less arch in it, which is going to contribute to tail wheel shimmy because you're going to lose that angle of that head. And it's going to be like a shopping cart that's hit a curb. It's going to vibrate all over the place. And there's the angle. As you can see, this one's kind of flat. And if it's flat or it's kicked back, it's going to shimmy. And that's my toolbox. That toolbox has got everything in it to change that tail wheel, to do with the tail wheel, tail spring, everything. Because my back hurts and my neck hurts, and I'm tired of getting up and down on the ground. So I put everything I need to do that job in that box. And whenever I go to do that job, I grab that box. Getting old sucks. There's my tail wheel box. Got everything I need in it to pull the tail wheel. It saved my back and my knees.
What's that eye bolt in there?
That's Bill Duncan's giving me all kinds of treasure. That's one of those bush wheel eye bolts. Everybody said they broke and cracked and all that. I've got one on mine and hadn't broken, cracked yet, but I've got 2 bolts. I've got an eye bolt and a regular bolt, and I keep looking at it and it's fine.
I liked mine too.
But Bill had those made, and then somebody, I think Tim Allen broke one. Somebody broke one, and that's supercub.org lure back then. This you can't. Oh, I can't spell. Yeah, Lou's telling me I can't spell old. Lou, when you crawl around on the floor for a living, then we can talk. So anyway, in that tail wheel shimmy thread, they're talking about those links coming off. Well, this is a friend of mine. They were coming back from Idaho, and he lost one of those links, and my old Travis vendor, he found a piece of bob wire on a bob wire fence, and he wrapped that around Eddie's tail tail steering chain. And when it came in for annual, it was still on there, and it was kind of hard to get off. But that was some of that good ranch hand adapt and overcome farmer ingenuity right there that worked. But anyway, when you're in a bind, you use what you got. So this is the bolt that attaches the tail wheel to the spring, and you use the and that's a grade 8 washer. And if you put an AN washer on there, they're soft and they'll cup them. So I've got a stash of grade 8 washers that are larger OD and also harder, and they won't cup. And so on the tail spring attachment, I use those grade 8 washers between the head and the tail spring and between the fuselage and the tail spring. Had a lot better luck with that. This is another picture of the aluminum steering arm on the bottom of the rudder. Look for play between that steering arm and the rudder itself, because you'll lose steering, and if you let it go, it'll get worse and worse, and it'll cause more and more problems. It's harder to repair. These are AN3 eye bolts. I can't remember the exact part number. Spruce carries them, but that's an eye bolt. And I put that in that steering arm because these springs, a lot of times they'll put the spring in that steering arm, but it wears an oblong hole in that steering arm. So I put this AN bolt in there with a nut on it, and then, so it just rotates, and the spring can wear on that eye bolt and not on that steering arm. So steering arms are expensive. You got to pull the tail wheel spring off to get them out. It's just on and on and on. It turns into a snowball. And here's what happens if you just use the spring without the eye bolt. It makes a figure 8 hole. Will you go back to that picture, Steve? I don't know if everybody caught that, but there's a figure 8 hole right there. And then I changed that's the wear on a tail spring bolt between the head and the spring. And I keep those things in stock, the AN7-21 or an AN7-22, depending on what spring you got. But I keep them because I replace them most every year, just because it's a high wear item and it's sitting there trying to break all the time. So there's one that I pulled out not too long ago. That one had been in there a while. You can see the corrosion on that bolt, and it was just a matter of that. It wasn't going to take long, I don't think, before that one broke. And that was between the fuselage and the spring. But I changed the spring, and that was the bolt I found. You can see all the corrosion in there. And there's a sloppy hole in a steering arm. You can see that shadow around those bolts. Just a lot of play.
Hey, Steve, somebody on YouTube asked if you have an opinion about the T3 system.
No, I'm certified and I'm just using springs. I mean, that I don't know that much about the T3. I've worked with that version of the one that Acme makes. I've worked on that on a Carbon Cub, and it's pretty nice. I've talked to Dan about the T3, but I haven't used one. The kind of flying I do, I keep the tail up until I stop, and I set the tail down. And I'm not running in any rough stuff. We'll get some gravel and rocks, but nothing real rough. So, there's a lot of people that like it, but it's open for debate on the approval as well. So, anyway, I know Acme's working on the approval. I'm not sure if Airframes and Dan are working on approval of T3 or not, but it would take some vibration and shock and all that out of the tail, which would be a good thing. So we talked about having another one of these videos on just some funny stuff that happens, but these are the bearings out of the tail wheel of a buddy of mine that took an adjacent 90-degree turn into the river, cobbed the power and powered himself out. And I didn't believe him. I didn't see it. One of our buddies saw him do it, and I got there and they told me about it, and I thought they were pulling my leg until I saw water running out of his hubcap on his 29-inch Airstreaks. And then I believed him. And then when I did the condition inspection on it, then I found the rust in the tail wheel bearings. So, if you get your tail wheel into the water, you might want to look at those bearings, because even with the lip seals that Bill Duncan came up with for the Scott 3200, it's still, you can get some water in there and it'll rust those bearings in those races, and they're not fun to get the races out. But, okay, now we're on to the brakes. So Scott, Cleveland double tuck brakes, pretty much standard on Cubs. Some people might still have the old expander tubes, but anyway, these calipers are magnesium most of the time. Sometimes they're aluminum, and they're prone to corrosion, leaks, whatever. This is my little toolkit for servicing brakes, and I look at them every annual. So these pins that the brakes pivot on need to be lubricated with silicone spray, because silicone spray will not attract dirt, and it'll allow those pins to slide on that torque plate, and that brake needs to slide because it needs to wear evenly on both sides of those pads. This particular one, if you look in the bottom corner there, it's got, see this pad on the right, all that dark gooey stuff, that's from an O-ring leaking on the brake caliper. And you got 2 pistons in there and 2 O-rings. It's pretty easy to pop those out, put new O-rings on. This is a Cleveland tool to check the gap on the pad is 100,000. The pad the minimum is 100,000, and that's a Cleveland gauge. And so that check that pad thickness. I do it at annual, and some of the pads will have a notch cut in them that's kind of a wear notch. A side note, when I put 35s on, I noticed my 35s, my brakes weren't that effective. I was talking to Robbie Grove, and he told me either use, factory Cleveland pads or his pads, Grove pads. He said the Rapco pads, when they did some testing with them, they weren't happy with the testing that they did, because they were going to use those Rapco pads. Well, anyway, I put a set of Grove pads on, and I did not lose any brakes on 35s. I was real surprised. I've got the same braking power that I had on 35s that I had on 31s. I was pretty happy with that. So I like the Grove pads. But anyway, it's just checking the thickness of the pad here with that little. And if you go to Oshkosh or Sun and Fun, Cleveland gives that away. And then this is spraying those pins with that silicone spray so that they slide easy. And checking wheel bearings and taking a wheel off and all that fun stuff. Paco sitting on dozer. They're a bonded pair, but like on small tires like this, I just use a floor jack with a block of wood under it, put it underneath the axle. On bush wheels and stuff, I've got a hoist, I've got a come along in the ceiling, and then most everything I maintain on big tires has got the Alley Dodge lifting eyes on it, so I can pick the airplane up and service the wheels that way. It's hard to get underneath the wheel, a big tire with a jack. That Bogart, I've got a Bogart jack, works real well, but they quit making it. So anyway, I've also got a piece of angle iron that that's the right length. I can stick under there and pick up one side with a floor jack. That works real well as well. It just it picks up on both axles, and then you've got the floor jack further on one axle, and you pick it up off the ground. That's always can be a pain. This is that piston that was leaking, the one on the right. And that's with the pad removed, the inner pad removed. You can see the two pistons in there. So the Scott pedals, most all Super Cubs have. It's a cast aluminum part, and if you've got stock brakes, there's a diaphragm, there's a rubber diaphragm in there, and it's moving a high volume of fluid at a very low pressure. And with big tires, I mean, this one's still stock, but with the big tires, you want some more brake. So, people put brake boosters on. And let's see here. So where that pedal comes off, this pivot point right here is known to break. And there's broken ones. So there's one with it broke off. There's one where somebody drilled a new hole. There's one where somebody welded. I mean, I've got boxes of these things. And so look at those ears and make sure that, because people, they romp on those brakes. That airplane's not going the right direction they think it should be. They think that they push harder on that brake, it's going to start going. And unfortunately, the brake plays a price a lot of times. So. And these are Huff master or parking brake valves, and they're cracked where somebody screwed the fitting in. They screwed it in too far. Most of the time, you got a Scott valve. I've seen a couple of Cubs that have these Huff valves in them. But
Hey, Steve. Somebody asked if there was any suggestions on bleeding the brakes on Cleveland's when the bleeder valve is on top of the brake.
Well, it should bleed the same. I mean, there's a thread on supercub.org with pictures, but I mean, you can take the caliper off and bleed it, and point it down, but if it should bleed up, all the air is going to come out unless you have it sideways, and then air will get trapped in that piston, in that piston bore. But I've bled them top and bottom without any problem with a pressure pot. I use a pressure pot with a clear hose.
Yeah, most of the time you sort of reverse bleed to what you do on a car. You
pump pressure. Right. These are the original diaphragms, and this is a ruptured one, but you can't really tell it until you push on it. There's the rupture. We landed on a gravel bar in 90 horse Cub, and he kept going. I was like, what the heck's he doing? And then he kind of went 90 degrees and all kinds of red fluid ran out. And anyway, so here's the stock setup with the Scott parking brake valve. And then I use these are NAS. I went forward and I didn't mean to. Those are NAS cap screws, Allen head screws. Makes it a lot easier to put those in. But you've got a lot of options on brakes, and I mean, I'm not trying to push anybody's brakes, but I've had the best luck out of Dakota Cub brakes and Steve's brakes because they're the two that are vented. And when Tom and I were flying together, my Cubs got Dakota Cub brakes, and Tom had North River, which is now airframes, and he was having to put fluid in and take fluid out, depending on if it was hot or cold or what was going on, because it's a sealed system. It doesn't make up for temperature or atmospheric pressure. Where the Dakota and the Steves have got a vent, they're vented. So you have a reservoir, you put fluid in it, check it at annual, and leave it alone. So and when I was talking to Mark Engelert earlier, he said if you've got the non-vented brakes and you want to get real good braking, you push the brakes and get the pads as close together as possible, and then pull the parking brake valve on, and then top off the cylinder, and then put the cap on, and make sure that you can move the airplane around. But that was Mark's suggestion. I've got several customers that were tired of having the airplane comes to me once a year and gets an annual inspection and gets fixed or whatever, and then they take it to their place and then they have to deal with the brakes. And I've had several people, what's the problem with these brakes? They're leaking, but I can't find any fluid anywhere, and I keep having to add fluid. And I told them that's just the nature of those brakes. I said I can put, Steves or put Dakota Cubs on. You fill up the reservoir, and you're not going to have to mess with it. So I put a lot of Steves on because they're easy to put on a covered Cub. On rebuilds, I use the Dakota because the Dakota's the whole brake is new. Everything is new. You're not reusing the frame like you are in this picture. You're using the you've got a whole new brake on the Dakota. But the other brakes work, and you can make them work fine. It's just a matter of if you want to spend the time messing with them or if you want to fly. So it's the same old adage, time and money. If your gear's covered, like I said before, fabric's a tattletale. This gear's got the rear tube's bent, and you can see a wrinkle in the fabric. So it's obvious. But the landing gear needs to be looked over pretty good. That's why we got safety cables, and look for swelled up spots and tubes at the joints. Yeah, I've heard a couple times of the rear seat heat going and heating up the fluid in the brakes and then locking the brakes up. And they had one out west that flipped over because of that. That fluid expands and pushes the brakes, and it could be bad. But on this landing gear, that you've got several clusters there, and if you check those clusters for swelled up tubes, deformed paint, fabric, cracks, I mean, these gear take a heck of a beating. So you get into shock struts. So on the bottom, so I just took this 52 model down, and on 150 horse Super Cub, they've got hydrosorbs. It's like in the second picture. The hydrosorb with bungees wrapped around it. The Monroe shock takes the spring back supposed to take the spring back out of the bungee. The one on the bottom is the later model J3 and early Super Cub. It's just a tube sliding inside of a tube. On 150 horse, 1,750 pound gross weight Super Cub, it's not supposed to have this bungee, this lower shock strut that's in this bottom picture. It should be the hydrosorb. And I found a couple like that where people just didn't know, didn't care, whatever. But the early Super Cubs had the same shock strut as the later J3s. And then when they upped the gross weight, they went to that hydrosorb gear that's shown the one that's shown above. And you can tell because the cans are longer. You see the can on the bottom is shorter. That's for a standard, that's for the early style. And then the longer can is for the hydrosorb style. People ask me all the time about inspecting bungees. And, if you look at these, the cords are all, the cords that are wrapping the rubber bungees are all in good shape. They're not deformed. Mainly what I see is big knots. You'll get a knot in the bungees, and it'll knot up in one area. But usually they start to sag. You'll see one gear splayed out further or something like that. And then also with the hydrosorbs, look for hydraulic fluid in those cans because they do have hydraulic fluid in that shock, and it'll leak out the seals. It's another one of those things. Bungees are a pain. These cans are a pain. They got PK screws in them, and they're always stripped out. My daughter and I put nut plates in this one, and that was another challenge. We got it done, but it was kind of a pain back at the trailing edge where it teardrops. But it's nice now because I can get the screws out, and I don't have to mess around and use 3 different size screws. But I don't know. I've got ASOS on mine, and I like them because I don't have to do anything to it but fly it. I look them over, and they take the bounce out and the spring back. And Acme's working on some shocks. And maybe somebody else is working on some shocks. These are the nut plates that we put in so that I'm not screwing a PK screw in a piece of sheet metal. And here's these late model Cubs have got a fairing that goes around the brake line where it comes out of the fuselage and goes down the gear leg. And then also this is the Cobain fitting that, in that oops video where Bill Tracy's airplane had the broken Cobain fitting. You can see the Cobain fitting real good in this picture. Cobain V. You know, keep that stuff clean and look it over, because it has been known to fail. And there's Bill's. I had breakfast with Bill this morning, actually, but there's that. That's the result of that Cobain fitting breaking, even with the safety cables, and that's still kind of a mystery. I think it shifted to one side, and the safety cable doesn't do good in compression. So anyway, there's that failed fitting. Is that the last one, Steve?
That's your last slide, Mr. Pierce.
Wow, I still have a voice.
and Lee hasn't thrown a pillow at you, and Kathy hadn't wrung your neck. So
he woke up. He's over here pissing and moaning, but you know. But anyway.
Well, just maybe real quick, if anybody's got any last minute questions, we can do that real quick, and then we can let you get to bed so you can go to your you can get on with your life tomorrow.
Well,
I think that was awesome. And you know, this is 3 parts. It's like you know, it's a what 7.5 it's an hour and a half, 3 it's almost 5.5 hours of going through an inspection. So if it only takes
this is Wendy just sent me this. This is a bad bungee cable. I think she got all the good use out of that she could, if that's Wendy's airplane. But anyway.
So if it only takes 5.5 hours to do a whole inspection on a Super Cub, how come it's so expensive?
You've been here when we've done an inspection on a Super Cub. You know that.
I know, you got to take a lot of phone. You have to take a lot of phone calls right in the middle of the work.
You gotta watch it because it's dirty.
He sits in the office and plays on the computer, and Laura and I do the annual inspection.
I fix the computer. I don't play on it, by the way.
Hooks up Wi-Fi stuff, and he does what he knows how to do, and I do what I know how to do.
It's probably better that way. Steve, again, thank you so much. This was just really fantastic. And I know you've got some other things kind of you're thinking about doing later, and I know you'll have a great audience for that too. I mean, it was a hang in there thing, but I think these 3 videos are going to be referenced by a lot of folks for a long time. And it's really great to have all these little tips and tricks kind of caught up and in place. So we sure appreciate you taking the time to do it, even on vacation.
That's vacation.
Hey, what
Thank you, and thank you, Kathy. I know you're back there with the pillow over your head, but thank you.
He's sitting in the chair. Lee's over there with a pillow over his head.
He's heard all this before. So, all right. Well, thank you again, Steve, and thanks everybody for hanging in there with us. And again, next week you get the week off.
Go watch reruns.
Right. So you go watch reruns of Cheers or something. And you can watch reruns of this too. So, all right. Good night, everybody. Thanks again, Steve.
All right. Take her easy.